She slid a piece of paper across the table like it meant nothing. Like my father's entire life could be summed up in a single page she had already decided the meaning of. There was no formal will, Diane said. Her voice was calm and unbothered. Everything has already been handled. I sat across from her inside the lawyer's small office. The room smelled like old paper and furniture polish. The attorney, a quiet man named Mr. Peel, kept his eyes fixed somewhere between his notepad and the wall. Anywhere but my face. What do you mean, handled? I asked. My father owned a manufacturing business. There was property, equipment, savings. How is any of that just handled? She folded her hands on the table. Grief is hard enough without dragging it into a legal battle, sweetheart. This arrangement is better for everyone. That word, sweetheart, scraped against me like rough sandpaper. Don't make this ugly, she added quietly. Your father wouldn't have wanted that. I picked up my bag and walked out. The parking lot felt too bright, too open. I stood beside my car and tried to breathe. Her words had been too smooth, too prepared, like she had practiced them in front of a mirror before walking in. One question burned through everything else. What was she hiding? My name is Maya Collins. I am 29 years old, and I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. If you are new here, please subscribe to this channel. I share true stories just like this one every week, and I promise you will not want to miss what happens next. 2 nights after that meeting, someone knocked at my apartment door just after 10 o'clock. I was not expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and felt my breath catch. It was Grandpa Walt. My grandfather, Walter Collins, was 74 years old and rarely left his house after dark. He moved slowly these days, with a slight lean to the right from an old back injury. Seeing him standing on my doorstep at that hour told me this was not a casual visit. I pulled the door open. He stepped inside without a word and sat down at my small kitchen table. In his hands was a thick manila envelope, worn slightly at the corners like it had been handled many times. Your father came to me, Grandpa said, his voice low and careful. A few months before he passed. He was worried, Maya. He talked to me about the will. I pulled out a chair and sat across from him. My hands felt cold, even though the apartment was warm. He slid the envelope across the table. Inside was a photocopy of a document, official-looking, typed out formally, with my father's name at the top. I read through it slowly, carefully. Diane's name was listed differently from what she had told us at Mr. Peel's office. Very differently. Is this real? I whispered. Grandpa looked straight at me. Your father made sure I kept a copy. He trusted me to hold on to it. I could not sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while memories of my father kept surfacing, one after another, like pieces of a puzzle I had never known I needed to solve. One conversation kept coming back louder than all the others. It was about 8 months before he died. We had been sitting on his back porch after dinner, watching the sun go down over the neighborhood. He seemed more serious than usual that evening, quieter. He kept turning his coffee cup around in both hands like he was gathering his thoughts. I want things to be fair, Maya, he said. Between you and Diane. That is all I have ever wanted. I had nodded and smiled and told him not to worry. I thought it was just his way of keeping peace in the house. I let the moment pass without asking any questions. Now that moment felt like a warning I had missed completely. If my father had already made a will, one that Grandpa's photocopy seemed to confirm existed, then what Diane had told us at Mr. Peel's office did not match. Not even close. I sat up in bed and turned on the lamp beside me. I pulled out the photocopy and read it again from the top. My father had said he wanted things to be fair. So why had Diane told me, to my face, that nothing had ever been written down? Something changed after he died. I was more certain of that now than I had been of anything in a long time. The next morning I drove to my father's manufacturing shop on the east side of Columbus. Raymond Collins Fabrication had been open for over 30 years. My father built it from 2 machines, a rented unit, and more early mornings than anyone could count. Walking through the front door had always felt comfortable, familiar. That morning it felt different. Quieter. Off somehow. The office at the back. The one my father had used for as long as I could remember was locked. A strip of tape was stretched across the door frame with a handwritten note. Staff only, no unauthorized access. I turn around to find Tommy Briggs standing nearby. Tommy had worked at the shop for 12 years. He was one of the longest-serving employees my father had, and he had always been friendly. That morning, he avoided my eyes the moment I looked at him. "What happened to my dad's office?" I asked. Tommy shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Mrs. Collins had it locked up last week. Said she was reorganizing things." "Reorganizing what? Can I go in?" He shook his head slowly and glanced toward the front where another worker was pretending to type. "I'm sorry, Maya." She gave specific instructions. I thanked him and walked back outside into the morning air. Files removed. Office locked. Just weeks after the funeral. Someone was cleaning up a trail, and they were not being careful about hiding it. I called Mr. Peel's office the next morning and asked for another meeting. His assistant said he could fit me in Thursday afternoon. I arrived hoping for honest answers. What I found instead was a wall. Mr. Peel sat behind his desk with his fingers laced together, looking calm in a way that felt practiced and forced. He repeated almost everything Diane had already told me, word for word in some places. No formal will. Assets handled internally. Nothing left to review. The phrasing was nearly identical to hers. "Mr. Peel," I said carefully, "are you certain there was no other documentation? No secondary copy filed anywhere else?" His expression stayed flat, but something shifted behind his eyes. A small tightening, almost invisible. "The estate was handled according to the information made available to me," he said. "By Diane? By the family." I let a long pause sit between us. Then I reached into my bag and placed the photocopy Grandpa had given me flat on his desk. I did not explain it. I did not say anything. I just let him look at it. He glanced down. His jaw tightened slightly. The fingers that had been perfectly still pressed harder against each other. He did not say another word about the document. But that reaction, that small, controlled reaction, told me everything I needed to know. There was a crack in the story she had built, and I had just found it. I went back to Grandpa Walt's house that evening. He lived in the same small brick home on Fairfield Avenue where my father had grown up. The kitchen always smelled like strong coffee and something warm from the oven. The old radio in the corner was always playing low. He poured me a cup without asking and sat across from me at the kitchen table. "There is more," he said before I could even open my mouth. "I did not want to put everything on you at once the other night." I set down my cup. "Tell me." He leaned forward slowly. "About 3 weeks before your father went into the hospital, he called me. He sounded careful, Maya, like he was choosing every single word before he said it." "What did he say?" "He told me that if anything happened to him, he was afraid someone might try to simplify things after he was gone." Grandpa paused and looked at me. That was the exact word he used. Simplify. He said my father had been very specific. He did not want things simplified. He had worked too hard his entire life. He wanted what he had built to go exactly where he intended it to go. "He told me he had built a safety measure into everything," Grandpa said quietly. "Something designed to stop exactly what appears to be happening right now." My pulse quickened. "What kind of safety measure?" Grandpa folded his hands on the table and looked at me steadily. "That is what we need to find out." We spent the next 2 hours going through the photocopy together at Grandpa's kitchen table. He had a magnifying glass and a yellow notepad where he wrote things in his slow, careful handwriting. I went through the document line by line while he followed along. Most of it was what I expected, standard legal language about property, finances, and named beneficiaries. But buried near the bottom of the second page was a short clause I had skimmed past the first time I read it. It referenced another attorney. Not Mr. Peel. Someone entirely different, a firm called Harmon Estate Law, based in a town called Millbrook, about 90 miles from Columbus. The clause was brief, but very specific. It stated that a duplicate record of all estate documents had been filed with Harmon Estate Law as a secondary measure, and that this record held full legal standing equal to any primary filing. I read the line 3 times. "She might not know about this," I said slowly. Grandpa nodded. "Your father was careful. He knew Mr. Peel well enough, but this second copy, he set that up privately. On his own. Quietly. Why didn't he tell me? He probably did not want to make things complicated while he was still here, Grandpa said. But he made absolutely sure a backup existed in case things went wrong after he was gone. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. If that second filing was real, Diane's entire version of events had nowhere left to stand. We decided to drive to Millbrook the following Saturday. Grandpa drove slowly on the highway, both hands on the wheel the way he always had for as long as I could remember. I sat in the passenger seat watching the flat Ohio fields roll past outside the window. The sky was pale gray, the kind of morning that cannot decide whether to rain or hold off. I kept going over everything in my head. The meeting at Mr. Peel's office. The locked door at the shop. Tommy's nervous eyes when I asked simple questions. Grandpa appearing at my door late at night, carrying an envelope my father had placed in his hands like a secret meant for exactly this moment. Part of me kept wondering if I was reading too much into everything. Maybe Diane had told the truth. Maybe the clause in the photocopy had a different meaning than what we thought. But then I remembered Mr. Peel's face when I placed the document on his desk. That jaw tightening. Those fingers pressing harder. Innocent people do not react like that. We pulled into Millbrook just after noon. Harmon Estate Law was on a quiet street near the center of town, a small, clean brick building with a wooden sign out front that looked like it had been standing for 40 years. I took one slow breath before we walked through the front door. I did not know if we were about to find real proof or a dead end, but we had come too far to even think about turning back. The receptionist at Harmon Estate Law was a polite older woman who asked us to take a seat while she checked something in the back. The waiting area was small and quiet. 2 chairs. A side table with a green potted plant. Framed certificates hung on the cream-colored wall. I sat with my hands in my lap and tried not to overthink the next few minutes. Grandpa sat beside me. He held his notepad on his knee, but did not write anything. He just held the pen and waited. After about 10 minutes, the receptionist returned and led us down a short hallway. At the end of it, a man in his mid-50s opened his office door. He introduced himself as Attorney Harmon, calm and measured, with reading glasses resting on his forehead. He shook our hands and asked us to sit down. Then he placed a sealed file on the desk between us. On the outside, in my father's handwriting, were the words, Raymond Collins, estate documents sealed. This was filed with us 14 months ago, Attorney Harmon said. The instructions were very clear. The file was to remain sealed unless the primary filing was not presented to all named parties within 30 days of the death. My throat tightened. Someone actively stopped that from happening, I said. He nodded once. It appears that is the case, yes. The sealed file sat there between us on the desk. My father had planned for this exact moment. Attorney Harmon opened the file carefully, pressing the pages flat as he turned them. The will inside was 4 pages long. My father's signature appeared at the bottom of each one, dated 14 months before he passed. A notary stamp was pressed clearly on every page. I read through the whole thing with Grandpa leaning in beside me. It was clear, well organized, exactly the kind of document my father would have written, practical and fair, with no room for misunderstanding. Diane inherited the house they had shared together. That made complete sense. My father had always intended that for her, and nothing in our family had ever suggested otherwise. But Raymond Collins Fabrication, the manufacturing business my father had spent 30 years building, was supposed to be divided. Diane would receive a calculated financial share of its total value. The management and day-to-day operational control were meant to pass directly to me. There were also savings accounts and investment holdings listed, all of them split according to specific percentages my father had written out clearly. None of this had been mentioned at Mr. Peel's office. Not one word of it. How was this just ignored? I asked quietly. Attorney Harmon folded his hands. Our records show that Mr. Peel's office submitted an initial request to begin the official filing. That request was withdrawn 9 days after your father passed. Withdrawn by who? He slid a document across the desk toward me. The authorization was signed by Diane Collins. The room went completely still. I stared at the withdrawal authorization for a long time without speaking. Diane's signature sat right there on the page, her printed name beneath it, the date stamped clearly in the corner. 3 days after my father's funeral. 3 days. He had barely been buried. The sympathy cards were still arriving at the house. Neighbors were still bringing food to the door. People were still calling to say they were sorry. And 3 days after we stood at that graveside, Diane had signed paperwork to quietly pull the legal filing that would have protected everything my father built. I thought about how she had been during those early days. Quiet.
Composed.
A little withdrawn, but I had told myself that was just how she grieved. I had given her that space without a single question. Now I understood what she had actually been doing during that time. She had not been lost in grief. She had been moving quickly, before anyone thought to look closely at anything. 3 days, I said out loud, mostly to myself. Grandpa placed a steady hand on my arm. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Attorney Harmon spoke carefully. Withdrawal requests typically come weeks or months into a process, not in the days immediately following a death. Can this be undone? I asked. It can be reviewed and formally challenged, he said, but it will require requesting that the entire estate process be reopened. I nodded once. Then that is exactly what we are going to do. We drove back from Millbrook with a certified copy of the estate file and a typed list of next steps Attorney Harmon had prepared for us. I wanted to call Diane the moment we hit the highway. I wanted to tell her I knew everything. But Grandpa talked me out of it before I could even reach for my phone. If you go at her now, he said, eyes on the road, she will have time to prepare. Time to build explanations. You will hand her an advantage she does not deserve. He was right. I knew he was right, even though everything inside me was pushing me to act immediately. Instead, we spent the following week working carefully and quietly. I made a detailed list of every piece of information we had collected, the photocopy, the estate file from Millbrook, the withdrawal authorization with its date, the timeline of events. I laid it all out on my kitchen table and looked hard for any gap or inconsistency. Then Grandpa began reaching out to people my father had trusted over the years. Old business contacts, longtime friends, people who had known Raymond Collins for decades and might remember details that seemed small at the time, but mattered now. We were not building a confrontation. We were building a record, a solid, clear, undeniable record of what had actually happened and what had been deliberately kept from me after my father died. Diane had moved fast, assuming no one would look closely enough.
She had been wrong about that.
It was Tommy Briggs who finally opened up completely. He called me on a Tuesday evening, which surprised me. I had not pushed him at all since the day I visited the shop. I had made a deliberate decision not to pressure anyone who might feel caught between loyalty to Diane and what they actually knew. But Tommy called on his own. I need to tell you something, he said. His voice was low and careful. I have been thinking about it every day since you came by the shop. Your father was a good man, Maya. A genuinely good man. And what I saw, I should have said something a lot sooner. He told me that the night after my father's funeral, the very next night, Diane had come into the shop after closing time. She had let herself in through the back entrance using a key. Tommy had been working late finishing up an inventory check. She did not know he was still there. He watched quietly as she removed several filing boxes from the shelves along the back office wall and carried them out to her car. Then he heard the shredder running for nearly 20 minutes straight. I did not know what she was destroying, he told me, but I knew for a fact that none of those files were ever her things. Nothing in that office was ever hers. I thanked him and wrote down every detail word for word. That statement, combined with everything else we had gathered, was now building something that could not be explained away. I asked Attorney Harmon to arrange a second meeting with Mr. Peel. This time I brought the full timeline printed clearly on paper. I laid everything in front of him in order. The date my father died. The date the withdrawal request was submitted. The date Diane had signed it. The date Tommy heard the shredder running. The sealed estate file from Millbrook. The document trail Attorney Harmon had certified. Mr. Peel sat across from me in his own office and, for the first time, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. I was told the will was outdated, he said at last. She told me your father had communicated different wishes verbally in his final weeks, that the written document no longer reflected what he truly intended. And you accepted that without asking for any kind of proof. I said. He shifted in his chair. She was the spouse. She was grieving. I had no reason at that point to question what she was telling me. Did she pressure you to delay? A long silence followed. She was very insistent, he said carefully. She called multiple times in the days after the funeral. She said it would be better for the whole family if the estate was settled privately and quietly, without a formal review process. He cleared his throat. I should have asked more questions. I understand that now, and I take full responsibility for not doing so. It was not a full admission of wrongdoing, but he knew exactly what had happened, and now he knew that I knew it too. 2 days after meeting with Mr. Peel, I went back to the manufacturing shop. Tommy let me in through the side entrance early in the morning, before anyone else arrived. He led me to the storage room at the far back of the building, a long space with heavy metal shelving on both sides, stacked with old equipment logs and supply records going back years. Your dad kept backup copies of everything back here, Tommy said. I don't think she ever came in this far. She focused on the front office and never looked past it. We searched for about 20 minutes, moving carefully through the shelves. Behind a row of outdated machinery catalogs, pushed back between 2 cardboard boxes, was a small black safe. Old model, combination lock. I did not know the combination, but Grandpa did. It was the year my father started the business. Inside were 15 years of accounting logs, equipment insurance records, and a single white envelope. My name was written on the front in my father's handwriting. Not just Maya. Not initials. My full name, Maya Louise Collins, written in his careful, deliberate letters. Each one formed the way he had always written since I was a child. I picked it up with both hands. My hands were not steady. Tommy stepped quietly out of the room and gave me space without being asked. I stood alone under a single hanging light, holding something my father had left behind for me, and I slowly prepared myself to read it. The letter was 2 pages long, written by hand on plain lined paper. My father's handwriting was neat and even, the kind that never changed no matter how old he got or how tired he was. Every letter was formed the same way it had always been. He started by saying he was sorry. Not for anything specific, just sorry that I was reading this at all. He wrote that if I was holding this letter, then something had not gone the way he had hoped it would. He said he had been worried for months before he got sick. Not about dying, he had made his peace with that. He was worried about what might happen after, about whether the things he had built and cared for would end up in the right hands. He had done everything he knew how to do to make his wishes clear and legal and protected. But he wrote that he could not control what other people chose to do once he was gone. Then came the line I had to stop at. Maya, do not fight this with anger. You don't need anger. Fight it with the truth. Stand firm. Ask questions. Keep records. The truth has a way of holding itself up when everything else falls apart around it. He ended with one short paragraph. He said he had never doubted me, not once in his life. Whatever I chose to do, he trusted me to do it with dignity. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. I did not cry right then. I saved that for later, when I was alone. Right now, I had work to finish. I was careful in the days that followed about who I spoke to and exactly how much I shared. Attorney Harmon had advised me to keep everything quiet until we were completely ready to make the formal request for an estate review. One wrong conversation, one piece of information that reached Diane too soon, and she would have time to prepare a response and close whatever gaps still existed.
But she found out anyway.
On a Wednesday morning, my phone rang. Diane's name appeared on the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I answered, kept my face neutral, and said hello. Maya. Her voice was warm. Warmer than it had been in weeks. I have been thinking about you. I know this whole process has been hard, and I just wanted to call and check in. I said nothing. I think we got off on the wrong foot at that first meeting, she continued. I would love for us to just sit down and talk like family. I am sure we can work everything out between the two of us without making it more complicated than it needs to be. That word again, complicated. She loved that word. I noticed she did not ask what I had been doing lately.
She did not ask who I had spoken to.
She used soft, careful words and waited for me to soften too. She was nervous. Something had found its way back to her. "Sure," I said calmly. "Let's talk." My voice was steady. My father's words were in my head. Stand firm. Ask questions. She invited me to dinner at a restaurant downtown on Friday evening. I arrived 5 minutes early and chose the seat with my back to the wall, so I could see the whole room clearly. Diane came in 10 minutes later, dressed neatly, carrying a small handbag. She smiled when she spotted me, the kind of smile that took visible effort to hold in place. The first half hour was surface conversation. She asked how I was managing. She talked about the house, about how quiet it had been. She mentioned the shop briefly, describing it as a burden she was trying to handle responsibly on everyone's behalf. Then the waiter cleared our plates and Diane reached into her handbag. She slid a document across the table toward me. "I had a proposal drafted," she said, her voice gentle and reasonable. "It would formally remove you from any legal involvement with the business in exchange for a one-time payment. A clean break, Maya. No courts, no formal hearings, no dragging the family name through anything messy or public." I looked down at the document. I did not pick it up. "What is the payment?" I asked. She named a number. It was less than a quarter of what the business was actually worth, and I knew the numbers precisely because I had reviewed the accounting logs from the safe. I looked up at her across the table. "I need some time to think about it." She smiled again. "Of course. Take a few days." I placed my napkin on the table. My hands were perfectly still. She had just confirmed everything I needed to know. I called Attorney Harmon first thing the morning after that dinner. I told him everything. The phone call earlier in the week, the restaurant, the document she had pushed across the table with its lowball number, and its promise of a clean break. He was quiet on the line for a moment. "She is running out of time," he said. "That offer tells me clearly that she knows something is about to come to the surface." I asked him what our next move should be. He told me that Grandpa had already been in contact with him throughout the week. While I had been managing Diane's carefully worded calls and sitting through that dinner, Grandpa Walt had been working steadily in the background. 2 days after our phone call, Grandpa formally requested that the estate review process be reopened. He did it through Attorney Harmon, using the sealed filing from Millbrook as the legal foundation. Because Grandpa was listed in my father's original will as the named backup executor, a detail I had not even noticed the first time I read through the document, he had full legal standing to make that request. The request was accepted and processed. An official estate review was now scheduled. When the legal notice arrived at Diane's address, she called my phone 4 times within 2 hours. I did not answer a single one of them. There was nothing left to discuss privately between us. Every card was now on the table, officially, legally, in writing. Whatever happened next was going to happen in the open. The estate review hearing was held at the county courthouse 3 weeks later. Attorney Harmon represented Grandpa and me. Diane had hired her own attorney, a fast-talking man in an expensive suit who moved like someone who was used to winning arguments on confidence alone. But confidence does not hold up well against a carefully built paper trail. The review board asked Diane's attorney to walk through the timeline of events following my father's death. He did it smoothly and quickly, speaking about an informal understanding between husband and wife, verbal wishes communicated in the final weeks of life, Mr. Peel's cooperative involvement, and a family that had simply tried to avoid unnecessary legal complication. Then Attorney Harmon began placing our documents on the table, one at a time. The sealed will from Millbrook. The withdrawal authorization dated 3 days after the funeral. Tommy's signed written statement about the shredding. Mr. Peel's own admission that he had been pressured repeatedly to delay the filing. The accounting records recovered from the safe. Document by document, the version of events Diane had built began to buckle under its own weight. Her attorney kept adjusting his arguments, trying to reframe each piece of evidence as it appeared. But there were too many pieces, and they all pointed steadily in the same direction. Board members began exchanging glances across the table. Diane sat beside her attorney with her hands in her lap and her eyes fixed forward. The polished, rehearsed confidence I had seen at that first lawyers' meeting was fading fast. Diane's attorney made one final push near the end of the hearing. He argued that my father had changed his mind verbally in the weeks before he died, that the written will no longer reflected his true wishes, that Diane, as his wife of several years, had simply been carrying out what Raymond Collins had told her he wanted for his family and his business. It was the last move available to them, and it was a weak one. Attorney Harmon was completely ready for it. If Raymond Collins communicated different wishes verbally, he said, his tone steady and unhurried, we would expect at minimum one witness who was present. A nurse, a family member, a close friend, someone who heard those wishes spoken out loud. He paused and let that sit in the room. The only witness being presented to support this claim is Diane Collins herself. Diane's attorney started to respond, but the board chair raised one hand. Is there any written documentation supporting the claim of verbal instruction? He asked. Her attorney shook his head slowly. No documentation at the present time. Any sworn statements from third parties who were present? Another slow shake. Not at the present time. The board chair looked at the documents in front of him. He looked at the sealed will. He looked at the full timeline laid out by Attorney Harmon. Then he nodded once and made a note on his pad. The room was completely silent. Diane's attorney leaned over and whispered something to her. She stared straight ahead and did not respond. Then Attorney Harmon did something I had not been expecting. He asked the board to turn their attention to a specific clause near the end of my father's will. It was a section neither Diane nor I had focused on during any of our earlier conversations. I had read over it during our time in Millbrook, but had not fully understood its weight until this moment. The board chair read it carefully. His expression shifted. He read it once more. Then he passed it to the other members of the board. The clause stated the following: if the will was intentionally withheld, misrepresented, or if any named party acted to prevent the legal execution of the document, operational control of Raymond Collins Fabrication would temporarily transfer to the named backup executor until all matters were formally resolved. I turned slowly and looked at Grandpa Walt, who was seated in the row directly behind me. He gave me the smallest possible nod. He had known about this clause. My father had told him about it directly, months before his death. It was the safety measure Grandpa had mentioned at the kitchen table on Fairfield Avenue. Diane's attorney was on his feet immediately. We object to the application of that clause on the grounds that... Please sit down, the board chair said, without raising his voice even slightly. Diane finally turned and looked at her attorney. For the first time since the hearing began, the calm was completely gone from her face. She looked like someone who had just understood that the exit she had been counting on was never actually there. My father had thought of everything. The board deliberated for 45 minutes. When they returned, the chair read the decision in a flat, professional tone that made every word feel heavier than the one before it. The will filed at Harmon Estate Law was recognized as the valid and legally binding document governing the estate of Raymond Collins. The withdrawal request submitted by Diane Collins 3 days after the death was found to be unauthorized and procedurally improper. All actions taken on the basis of that withdrawal were to be reviewed and reversed where applicable, in accordance with the terms of the original document. Effective immediately, and pending the outcome of a formal fraud investigation, operational control of Raymond Collins Fabrication would transfer to the named backup executor. Walter Collins, my grandfather. Grandpa Walt slowly got to his feet. He straightened the lapels of his jacket. He did not say anything dramatic.
He did not look at Diane.
He simply stood up, quietly and with full composure, exactly the way my father might have in the same room. Some of the employees who had come to the courthouse that day, Tommy among them, began to nod. A few of them exhaled in a way that made it clear they had been holding their breath for a very long time. Diane sat perfectly still beside her attorney. The polished, composed woman who had once told me not to make things ugly had nothing left to say and no moves left to make. The truth had spoken. It had not needed to be ugly at all. The following week, there was one final meeting. Diane came without her attorney this time. She sat across from Grandpa and me in Attorney Harmon's office, just the four of us in a quiet room. She looked different without the confidence she had always carried. Smaller somehow. More worn. She spoke first. I told myself it was what Raymond would have wanted, she said. Her voice was quiet and unsteady. I told myself the business was too much for you to take on alone, that I was actually protecting it by keeping things simple. I let her finish without interrupting. I know that was not the truth, she added. I was afraid. I thought I was going to lose everything after he was gone, and I made decisions that I should never have made. I did not respond with anger. My father's letter was folded in my coat pocket, and I had read the final paragraph again that same morning before leaving the house. I am not here to make you pay beyond what the law already requires, I said. But you need to understand that what you did caused real damage, not just to me, but to people who had worked for my father for years and trusted that this process would be handled honestly. She nodded without speaking. The legal process will determine what happens next, Grandpa said calmly. But this conversation needed to happen first between people. Diane looked down at her hands. A long silence followed. Then Grandpa stood, and the meeting was over. The estate was settled 6 weeks later, exactly according to my father's will. Diane kept the house, which had always been hers to keep. That had never been in dispute. The financial share of the business she was entitled to was calculated fairly and transferred precisely according to the document my father had signed 14 months before his death. Everything was done clearly and by the book. Operational control of Raymond Collins Fabrication came to me. I stood alone in my father's office on the first morning it was officially mine. The room had been cleared out during the investigation, but the bones of it were unchanged. The same old desk, the same window looking out over the shop floor below, the same faint smell of metal and years of work. Tommy came in without knocking and set a hot cup of coffee on the desk without saying a word. Then he walked back out. Outside the window, the machines were running. Later that afternoon, I walked out of the courthouse after signing the final papers with Grandpa beside me. The air was clear and cold, the kind of sharp autumn day where everything looks bright and exact and real. He put his arm around my shoulders as we reached the bottom of the courthouse steps. Your father always believed you would handle this the right way, he said. I thought about that letter, about standing firm when everything felt uncertain, about choosing truth over anger, even when anger would have been so much easier. I had a good example, I told him, and that was exactly enough.